Thank you, everybody, for joining us once again on our next session 301 on DSP amplifiers. This is a training course developed and being delivered by the fine folks at JL Audio. And we have with us today, we have a PowerPoint that doesn't want to work. So somewhere here we have Steve Teresi.
I'm right here, so hi.
That's right. Steve Teresi, he's in Florida. We have Kevin Ferry in Pittsburgh. We have Rob Haynes joining us from California as well. And
Earthquake Central, right, Rob?
Huh?
You had an earthquake overnight, didn't you?
The news to me.
Yeah, LA County had a small one, like a 3.8 or something.
Yeah, that doesn't count as an earthquake.
Doesn't even shake your coffee, right?
you guys keep those earthquakes down there, I should say. So what we are going to do is we're probably going to use the full amount of time, maybe an hour, maybe a little bit more. Hopefully, you guys are prepared to absorb the information because it's going to get a little heavy today, but in a good way. Feel free to ask questions. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat dialog box. If you don't see the dialog box, you might just need to enable that, and we will answer them as we go along. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass this along to Steve Teresi, who is the key player today. Stop sharing.
There you go.
There we go.
All right. Grab the ball. Hang on. Come presenter. And now presenter.
Look, Rob, I went and changed my shirt, so we're matching now. Steve's the only one that's not on the team.
Team world class.
That's right.
All right, so we're going to get into advanced tuning practices, and the first little bit here is really going to be a recap of a lot of things that we've already talked about. We're going to build on everything from the very beginning of the course all the way through to what the session 201 covered in our basic mobile tune. And I'm going to rely on you guys to remember all of that stuff, and as you come to expect from us, we're going to ask lots of questions. So get ready, here it comes. So before we actually start tuning a car, there's a couple of things that we need to remember. First, do you remember what measurement tools we use to analyze? What do we use? What tools? Anyone? Bueller? Any answers yet, guys?
RTA from Conrad. RTA.
What you're thinking. But remember, there are other ones, right?
Ears.
So built in, we can use ears. Excellent, we got them. Ears is one way, but we like using microphones. And why? Because we could share, capture, and analyze the data. How many microphones? Between 3 and 5 is recommended to get a wider area. And where do we put them? We spread them around the listening area. So in a car, we typically go around the head. In a boat, we might put it into different zones of a boat. And when we do a home, we might spread it across the couch. So that's how we're going to analyze. And what are we doing when we analyze? Well, we're trying to correct the 3 pillars of audio. And remember, level 1 was adjustment by channel that's level, how loud it is. And there's not a whole lot I can show you on that. You may get about the same loudness, so you're done. Level 2 was, pillar number 2 is the frequency response, and we use high pass and low pass filters and EQs, parametric or graphic, if whatever you want. And to remind you, that's when we tried to make left and right match. We make them, match each other. And Rob shared with us on level 201 that we work towards a target curve, and we're going to come back to that in a moment. This is just a high-level reminder of what we're doing. The third pillar of the 3 pillars was phase, or the timing relationship of things. And when it comes to how we adjust those things, we haven't really talked much about that yet. The most obvious thing that we deal with timing is delay. We can delay things, and that will affect the time. And there's another tool that we can use, and it's the phase EQ. Phase EQ is also known as an all-pass filter, and Kevin alluded to this, that it's one of those things that nobody really wants to talk about it because it's kind of hard to describe. Well, after today's session, you'll understand exactly how to use an all-pass filter, what it does, and exactly what to do with it. But before you do anything with phase, you have to make sure that you adjust for any differences in your setup. You need a reference, right? And there's a couple of different ways that you can establish a reference point. One way is with the tape measure. It's really fast, it's easy, it's cheap, and it's not particularly confusing. You take your tape measure and you measure each one of the driver locations, tweeter, mid-range, mid-bass, and sub for left and right, and you matched it up to the center point typically the tip of nose, right? So if you're doing a mobile audio system, you have a driver sit in the seat and you measure where that tip of nose is going to be, and you take all your tape measure measurements for that. You do this in the basic tune, and you just put in those dimensions into the distance fields in the tune software, and it'll automatically calculate the reference point for you. So that's fast and easy. And again, not confusing, and it's cheap. You already have a tape measure. If you want more accurate timing measurements, is really the best thing to do is to get impulse response measurements. Now, impulse response measurements, as the name kind of implies, it's the time it takes for a response to show up. You send a burst through the system, and the time it takes for the microphone to capture it is effectively your impulse response. Now, in order to capture this data, you do need some equipment, you need some understanding, and you'll need some time and patience. See what we did there? Time and patience. You can groan, it's okay, I can't hear you anyway. But what impulse response allows us to do, I like to say it removes any of the unseen delays. So when you actually go through this, what impulse response is you have a measurement system that's going to send a signal out to two different locations. One is basically a wire that loops right back around into the measurement system. The other signal goes out through the source unit and any other processors from the source unit to the amplifier through all the processing that happens in there. And even though it's electricity and it moves pretty fast, each one of those things is going to add a little bit of delay. And then as it goes from the amplifier out to the speakers, from the speakers it travels through the air and then to the microphone. So what an impulse response measurement is the difference between the short circuit, so to speak, the loopback wire, and all of those other delays. It'll factor all of those in. The tape measure measurement doesn't get all the unseen delays, but for the most part, and this is to answer Dave's question from yesterday, for the most part, it doesn't matter because those delays will be there all the time anyway. But if you actually want to analyze phase, you really need to make sure that you know exactly what you're dealing with. Impulse response allows for detailed analysis of the phase response, right? So that's where we're going with all this. Knowing that, once you get your impulse response measurements lined up and you're able to look at phase, we can actually take a look at what's going on with all the tools that we're going to work with. And we've talked about a number of them, but I'm just going to do a quick review on some of these things to go through. We're going to use EQs. Typically, we use that to manipulate the phase, the frequency response, high pass and low pass filters. You guys know this already. Delay and polarity, and the all pass or the phase EQ. These are the tools that we're going to talk about. We're going to peel back the layers and kind of show what they all do. And in order to look at the data, we have to establish that reference point. And again, what we're looking for when we use these tools is we need to, we're looking for changes in magnitude response or frequency response, and we're looking for changes in the time response or the phase. Right, so let's go ahead and look at what these references are going to be. You're going to see a lot of charts that look like this one. And if we define this chart across the bottom, we have the frequency response. And we know this from the earlier sessions, what frequency is, right? And we're going to measure this in terms of amplitude, which is over on the other side. The y-axis is amplitude. So frequency left to right, low frequency on the left, high frequency on the right, amplitude from lower amplitude to higher amplitude from the bottom to the top. Additionally, we're going to look at the phase response, which is going to be on the bottom. And again, frequency goes from left to right, and the phase is going to be measured in degrees. And the 0 line is in the center, right? And then we have 180 on top and minus 180 on bottom. Now, you'll remember that phase is 360 degrees. We kind of showed a waveform going through all of that. And you'll see this in a very different way. This is a two-dimensional image of a radial plot. I know that's scary. Well, yeah, it is. But we're going to explain exactly how to look at these responses to make them make sense. Well, let's get into it now. We're going to start off with the most basic of basic. We're going to talk about EQs. It's not just frequency adjustment. We only usually look at the frequency aspect of it, but there are corresponding changes that happen in the phase response. And as you change the Q values, as we've talked about with the parametric EQ, as you change the Q values, you're going to alter the shape of those relationships, both in the frequency domain as well as in the time domain. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. This is a 12 dB per octave cut on an EQ at 1 kilohertz. And it's got a standard Q. It's a pretty normal size Q. And if you look at the bottom graph, you'll see what's happening to the phase response. Both of these lines were flat. The amplitude of the frequency response was a straight line across from left to right, and the phase response was perfectly at 0. By altering the response with the EQ by cutting it down by 12 dB, we've changed the frequency domain with a 12 dB cut with that particular shape. But we've also created what I call a little wiggle in the phase response. The shape of that wiggle gives you that response that you see in a frequency. The two are directly related, which is why we like to look at them in screens like this. So if you look at this, you can see that's the center point. In the valley of the cut is where the wiggle is crossing the zero reference line in this particular case. Now there's other things we can do. We can actually do a boost. Now pay attention to the phase wiggle as we go from a cut to a boost. Did you notice how the wiggle changed its direction? So instead of being down, then up, this is up and then down. So you see that there's a relationship of changes in the magnitude response and changes in the phase response. And it all happens behind the scenes. You don't normally see this, but we're going to show you how you can look at that. And as you change the Q, as you know, we've already talked about, you change the Q of a filter on an EQ, it can be tighter or wider. And if we make it tighter, you see that that little wiggle gets tighter as well. And the center point, again, is your basic filter frequency at that point where the cut or the boost is going to happen. If we were to show you the boost, that wiggle would flip and it would go up first and then down as you go from left to right. So that's what's happening with EQs. We thought it was just frequency response, but there's so much more. Okay, next up we have high and low pass filters and band pass filters, which are really basically a combination of the two. And we know that this is altering frequency response by filtering off frequencies below the cutoff frequency and as well as above them, depending if it's a high pass or a low pass. So there is a phase shift that's going to depend upon the filter slope and the type. As you change the different, like a Butterworth or Linkworth-Riley, it'll change the shape. As you go from a 6 or a 12 or an 18 dB per octave, it's going to change the overall shape of the phase response as well. So if you take a look at this high pass filter, you can see that it's rolling off as we come to expect on the frequency response on the top. But look at the phase shift that takes place on the bottom. The phase is literally wrapping. It's going from minus 180 up to plus 180. It's literally going around. Imagine if that lower one was like a cylinder and it's rotating around. The phase is wrapping around. And the blue line really helps show you that the wrap is taking place at exactly the same point as the filter frequency. And this is going to be common. The phase adjustment or the phase shift that's taking place will always center around that filter frequency, regardless of the type. The shape of that will change based on the slope and the type of the filter, but it'll always look very similar to what you're seeing here with it, wrapping around like that. And it's true whether it's a high pass or here a low pass. You'll notice the phase response is the same. It's just the direction that the filters are being applied. And there's some electronics behind that. That's really irrelevant. The phase response is going to be the same for a given type and slope, regardless of if it's high pass or low pass. So that's what's going on with that particular tool. Next up, we're going to talk about delay. Now, here's where it gets interesting because delay has no effect on the magnitude response or the frequency response of an individual driver. So that's kind of a neat thing. So I'm not even going to bother showing you magnitude response because it's going to be a straight line the entire time. So I'm only going to show you the actual delay that shows up on the phase response. And that's what this looks like. So you'll notice that the phase response, as you go from left to right across the frequency range, it starts to go down and then it wraps up to the top point, and then it comes back down and wraps up again and then back down. Now this particular delay is taking place at higher frequencies. We've added a certain amount of delay, and you'll see that it's only affecting the higher frequencies. Now this is something that I learned from a guy named Bob McCarthy. He's really freaking smart. He wrote a book about all this stuff, and I learned a bunch from watching some of his videos and reading some of his book. And it's a direct correlation to stuff that we learned earlier. Things like phase, wavelength, period, all those things that we talked about will all show up right here and right now. So if you take a look at this waveform, it goes through the 180 or 0 through 180 or 0 and then back to 360 or minus 180. So if you look at that blue waveform and then you take a look at this particular trace, the one I just highlighted in yellow, we could do some interesting things with this. And I think it's fun and interesting to kind of tie all these things together. You can actually tell time by looking at the phase response. And that yellow line on the top end of it, I have a build on this. On the top end of it, where that red arrow is the beginning of the waveform. It's at the 180-degree point, and that's at 5K. As we go down, the 0 point is right at that middle line, and that's 10K, the green arrow. And on the bottom, that one's at 15K, and it winds up at the minus 180 point. Seeing that it's a complete wrap and looking at those frequencies, you can actually tell time with it. And that's a really cool thing. And this is where a lot of things will come together. So there's another formula that I'll just share with you that it will become more familiar in just a moment. So you could determine time by looking at the high phase point and the low phase point, right? And then divide that by 360. In this case, our high phase point is 180. and a low phase point is minus 180. If you subtract the two of those, you wind up at 360. What's 360 divided by 1? I mean, by 360 divided by 360. I gave you the answer. 1. Now, if you take that number and divide it by the high frequency and the low frequencies subtracted, so the high frequency is 15K and the low frequency is 5K, right? So you wind up with, come on. You wind up with 10K, right? So if you take 1 and divide it by 10K, wait, this sounds familiar. 1 over frequency, that's period. That's time. That's exactly what we're trying to do. 1 over frequency will tell us how much time has been delayed. And if you do that math, I'll save you the trouble. 1 over 10K or 10,000 gives us 0.0001 seconds. That's 0.1 millisecond. Just for reference, 0.001 is 1 millisecond and 0.01 is 10 milliseconds. Beyond that, you're not going to see it because that'd be 100 milliseconds, which no processor you're likely to use is going to be working with those kinds of values. So that's how you can tell time, the high frequency and low frequency, the high phase and the low phase. The relationship is the period, which we already know from our earlier sessions. I think that's really cool. The last thing I want to share on this particular screen is that the angle as you go from left to right is getting steeper and steeper. You'll notice the roll that it goes down to the first minus 180, and then from the upper 180 down to the second minus 180, you'll see that angle is getting steeper. And when you look at this slide, you'll see how much it's getting steeper, and it's almost to the point where it's straight up and down. Now, if you want to have fun, that angle and that line is exactly the same as the previous yellow line. It's simply moved over. And if you wanted to do the math, this one here, the high frequencies at 1500, the low ones at 500, it gives us 1 over 1,000, which is 0.001 seconds. This is a 1 millisecond delay. And we can tell that time by looking at those two relationships. That's why period was so important. And that's why wavelength was so important. And that's why all of this stuff is so important. It all comes down to the time relationship. Finally here, the high is 150, the low is 50. If you do the math, 1 over 100 in that point is 0.01 second or 10 milliseconds. 10 millisecond delay on a given channel will look like that in the phase domain. That's pretty cool. So there's your yellow line. It simply has moved from the right side of the screen to the left side of the screen. And just as a point of reference, when you have dialed everything incorrect, your time relationship is going to start from the upper left and slope down to the bottom right. If it's going the opposite way, if it's going from the bottom left to the upper right, that is preceding the signal. That means you've set your reference delay wrong and the signals are arriving too early. Now, since we can't go back in time, that's clearly a delay setting that's been done improperly at the beginning. That's why setting those reference delays are vital and why an impulse response is better than a tape measure, just to make sure that that doesn't happen. Which brings us to polarity. Polarity only impacts the time and phase as well. We've already talked about this, that it doesn't change the magnitude response. It's not going to alter your frequency response. Now, it's going to look like it changes phase by 180 degrees, but it doesn't actually shift time, only the direction. So if we take a look at this particular wiggle, what is this one? What causes a wiggle like this in the phase response? Waiting on an answer.
Conrad says a drop in EQ.
Ooh, good man. He's been paying attention. We know this. Absolutely. So if you cut by 12 dB at that particular frequency, you get a wiggle like this. I chose this because I wanted to challenge you guys and you passed. But if I flip the polarity on this, take a look what happens. It's exactly the same, but where it was once 0, it's now at 180, and where it was once at 180, it's now at 0. You could see it literally just split it and put it to the extremes. That's what a polarity inversion will do. It hasn't shifted time, it simply split it to the direction of it. Instead of being in the middle, it's now at the top and bottom. But remember that the top part is 180, the bottom is minus 180. If this was a cylinder, it's simply the other side of the cylinder. So that's an interesting way of looking at it. Okay, now we get to all-pass filter. All-pass filters only impacts the time and phase. It functions very much like a high-pass or a low-pass filter, but instead it does not change the frequency response at all. It only does the phase response. So it's not a high-pass or low-pass, it's an all-pass. It's not filtering any frequencies, it's letting them all pass through, and it's only affecting the time domain. So this is kind of a neat thing. Let's take a look at what these filters are going to look like. All pardon me. So here we have the phase response of an all-pass filter. In this case, it's set at 1,000 hertz. What does that kind of look like? Have we seen a shape like this before? Anything?
I'm waiting.
Wasn't that long ago.
Brandon says it looks like delay.
Ooh, well, delay, remember that changed the angle and it got steeper as you went from left to right. I like the way you're thinking though. So this is causing the roll off from left to right on that first one, but then the next wrap doesn't come down at a steep angle. It actually tapers off again. There's a different tool that we use that showed something exactly like this. Now remember, an all-pass filter is very much like two other types of filters, except it allows all frequencies to pass instead of high pass or low pass. So this is a little snippet from the earlier slide showing a high pass or a low pass filter. And you can see that those angles and that wrap is exactly the same as an all-pass filter, but the all-pass doesn't change the frequency response. So you don't get an acoustic attenuation. You only get a shift in phase. Now, when we talk about filters like a high pass or a low pass, we're often talking about like a Lincoln-Riley or a Butterworth, and we change the slope and things like that. But when it comes to all pass filters, we're not doing that. What we're changing there is we're changing things called Q. Now, we've heard this before. What does Q adjust when we talk about an EQ band? When you change the Q, what ultimately are you changing?
The width we got
The
from
shape,
Conrad.
really, the width. That's an excellent way. So
Brandon.
yeah, it's the whole, yeah, good guys. So
And Eminem chimed in too.
Good, it's working. They learned. Hey. So when it comes to all-pass filters, this green one here is a pretty standard Q shape. As you pull in the Q and make it a higher Q, you'll see that here in the purple one, it's pulled those two phase wraps in a little bit closer. And as we increase the Q even more for the blue one, you see that they're getting closer to that dotted line or the center point of the all-pass filter. So the frequency is staying the same, but the sharpness and the focus of the phase wrap is getting tighter and tighter until you get to the highest value, in this case, the pink curve. And it's right up against where that frequency is. So when you're looking at phase traces, and if you see something that needs a laser focus, a high Q all-pass may be the tool for you. Here's all of those filters kind of overlaid to give you an idea. As you increase Q, you go from the green down through purple, blue, and into the pink as you tighten up that Q. So that's what the tools are actually doing, both in magnitude response when appropriate, as well as in the phase response for all of them. So we're going to look at a new way to tune. And my mantra here is let the data guide you, or the data, whatever you say, let it guide you. And we talked in session 201 about using a target curve. Well, we also want to do that when setting filters. We're going to set filters based on target curves. So when it comes to setting things like the high pass, low pass, and any band pass filters, we are going to use a target to set those filters. So this is taking our basic tune and bringing it to the next level, which is really important, especially if you're dealing with a multi-way system like a three-way main or the sub. There's a lot of stuff going on, so we need to make sure that we dial in each one of those bands appropriately. Then we're going to EQ to that target, just like we did with the full range signal on the 201 basic tune. So that's where we're going. And you'll remember this slide from the 201 session, showing the several different types of target curves. The tan one, just for reference, is the one I usually use. Now, remember, when you set up to tune a system, you should always look at the raw response and kind of see what the target curve is going to be a good fit with before you do your initial adjustment. And I know that sounds a bit crazy, but knowing that the tuning to a curve process is really only the first part, it does make sense. Because we're going to change things, and then we're going to listen to it and adjust it anyway. So it's just a starting point. And sometimes it's a very good ending point too, but it's a starting point. And the goal of the target curve is to allow you to basically put the energy together in a more pleasing manner. And any one of these curves will do that depending on the system that you're working with. Okay, let's get into those target high pass and low pass filters. In a multi-way system, what you're really looking at is a sum of all the individual parts. So those target curves that we talked about in 201, and we just showed a couple of moments ago, those 4 different target curves, it's really a combination of each of the multiple parts of the given system. So what we're going to do is we're going to dial in each one of those parts towards that target. To illustrate that, take a look at this. The yellow curve is the sum of the white, the gray, the green, and the pink, or purple, whatever color you want to call that. So when you combine all of those individual responses, they will sum together to the overall target that you see in yellow. And what I'm suggesting for a more advanced tuning session, what you're going to do is tune each one of the individual bands, both left and then right, or with appropriate mono, like for a subwoofer. And we're going to tune that to each one of these targets. And we're going to start off with this pink one over here, the high frequency. So we'll start with this one. I took some measurements from a vehicle that's fairly close to me. And I'll confess, I had a little bit of an issue. I have no idea what the hell's going on down low. That noise is going to be present through all of this, and quite frankly, I didn't have time to go through and clean it all up, so I just left it in there. But if you take a look at this measured response, you see it's all jagged. That's a clue. If it's nice and smooth, that's an electrical response because there's very little fluctuation. But when you see jagged lines like this, it's almost always going to be an acoustic response. And if it is an acoustic response and it's really smooth, that means someone applied smoothing. And if you put too much smoothing on, you don't get to see some of these variances, which in some ways is good, but in some ways is bad. So just bear that in mind. There's some settings that allow these variations to be more combined or more spread out. When it comes to higher frequencies, I like to smoothen it out because they tend to be very, very narrow peaks and valleys, and it really just makes your mind go nuts. So if you can get rid of some of those, it's easier. What you're looking at here is about 1/6 octave smoothing, so it's not too aggressive. Normally, I'd actually crank that up a little bit, but it is what it is. And something I did want to point out, because it's bothering me now, I'm looking at the left half of the graph here, and I keep seeing that freaking spike down there at 35 hertz. This is actually helpful for you. When you look at the data, you know that my tweeter is not doing that. So you know that you can ignore that because there's just no tweeter in the world that's going to have nothing except for the extreme low frequency and then that nice stuff at the higher end. So when you're looking at data, be sure to self-analyze it and self-look at it and say what's real and what's not. And be comfortable with that to say, look, I can ignore that or find out what's causing it and figure that out. All right, so with that said, if you look at this tweeter, normally what I would say is I would like to alter my target to allow for this very good tweeter that can actually play down well into the 2 kilohertz region. Normally I'd say to adjust my targets, but that would require the ability to sum the individual parts to a new target curve by changing them on the fly. And there are tools to allow for that, but they tend to be complicated and they're far outside the scope of our conversation today. But if you have that ability, you can do that. But in this case, we're going to stay with the original target. So what I'm going to do here is I need to apply a high-pass filter to get rid of some of that energy below where that purple line is. So by putting a high-pass filter on there, I wind up at the pink curve. You can see the pink curve at the extreme end of it is almost a dead-on track to that curve. There's a really nasty spike somewhere, what is it, around 3K or something like that? That's okay. I have an EQ that I can pull that down to that target curve, no problem. But what about the higher frequency? Even though my target curve is tapering off, these tweeters are actually tapering off even more. And I know the mantra has been to cut, 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 and don't boost, but I'm going to tell you that we need to be fluid. We're going to focus on mechanics instead of a specific process. And the mechanics here are telling me that these tweeters are having a roll-off for whatever reason. And I might be able to fix that with an EQ, but I might not be able to. So I'm going to, again, employ my brain and say, don't worry about that right now. Match the target curve around those filter frequencies as much as we can, and don't worry about the extremities. We might be able to fix it with the EQ, so let's just kind of look into it a little bit more. So to clean it up a little bit, that's where we're at right now before we do any equalizing whatsoever. So now we just do what we did at 201. We tune it to that target curve. We adjust the EQ to make it match as close as we can. And through some creative magic, I was able to pull down the peak that's really prevalent right around that turn point. And I also use what's known as a shelving filter to improve the response above 10K, and I wound up with that. That's pretty darn good. You can see that it kind of tracks the target curve pretty well, and even the upper end has been tapered up. Now, there's been a lot of conversation about what you can boost and what you shouldn't boost. In this case, the amount of reduction at those higher frequencies in terms of power is significant. We got no issues boosting that up there. There's also not a ton of content up above 10,000 or 15,000 hertz anyway. So I have no problem doing a little bit of boost up there to match my target curve. So that's basically what we have now with the tweeter. And through the magic of computers, we're going to do the same thing on every other driver on the left side. And this is what I wound up with. And you can see that around the turn points, as I call them, the high pass and low pass filters, the slopes on that, Each of these equalized and filtered frequency responses are tracking with that very, very closely. And to me, that's the most important thing. When we start looking at phase traces, we want those to be as close as we possibly can because there's interactions that take place. It's why the yellow line is actually higher than the green and the gray or the green and the pink. It's summing them together, and if we get them right, we'll gain energy. If we get them wrong, we'll lose energy. So if I get those turn points correct, I'll wind up with an easier phase response to look at, and things get easier. We said in session 201 that the better you can get left to match right, the better it'll be when we start looking at phase, and we're going to show you exactly that right now. So this is the left channel. We did the same thing on the right channel, and you see we got very similar results on each one. The frequency responses, it's hard to tell in those graphs, but they're close, not dead on. All right? Now, I pause because this is where it gets intense. We're going to start looking at phase. So again, time needs a reference. So we talked about the tape measure, which is the time of flight compensation. We get the distance, from the speaker to the microphone. But a more detailed analysis is going to require impulse response measurements. And remember, what we're looking at here are, first, we're going to start looking at phase shift because we're only going to look at one channel. A single device will look at the phase shift. It doesn't change frequency response, and this is what's known as absolute phase. What we really care about is different than that. What we really care about is phase offset, or the difference between phase traces, between systems or devices, whatever the case may be. And this may change the frequency response due to the interactions in time. And this is what's known as relative phase, and this is frankly what we care about, especially as you get into lower frequencies. Above about 5K, it really doesn't matter that much phase because, first of all, you know about wavelength. And wavelength at higher frequencies is going to be less than the distance between your ears. So any phase relationships up there, you're not really going to pick up on because your hearing is too, it doesn't have that kind of resolution at the higher frequencies. But as you start going into lower frequencies, it does become more modal or more reliant upon the phase response. So what we really care about is this relative response of time, especially at lower frequencies. And as we get into looking at these relative differences, I'm reminded of the quote by that man, Bob McCarthy. This is what he said. He says, a phase is a radial function. In other words, it goes around and around like the cylinder we talked about earlier. And it could set your head spinning when it comes to reading 2D charts. So guess what we're about to do, guys? We're going to go look at some 2D charts. So your head's going to spin a little bit, but my goal here is to try to alleviate some of the head spinniness. Okay?
The gloss white with the LED.
This is a frequency response of, let's just say, a left speaker. On the top, we have the magnitude response, and on the bottom, we have the phase response. And you can see the wrapping mechanism going around there. As it goes from left to right, it goes off the bottom and shows up on the top. It goes down off the bottom and shows up on the top. It goes round and around and around as you go from left to right. That is a typical standard phase wrap, and that's normal. It doesn't have to be a straight line. There's no wrong phase and right phase. It's just phase. And when you compare it to another trace, you wind up with a relative phase. So you see the frequency response just like you would from a left system in a car or a right system in a car. We look at the other channel, you see the green one here. It looks similar, but there are some distinct differences. Now, when you look at each one by themselves, as we've mentioned, that's absolute phase, and we really don't care about that. What we care is relative phase, and we're going to compare the two. When we overlay them, we can see that there are some significant differences, not only in magnitude response, but more importantly, in the phase response. So if you take a look at this, on the phase response, on the left side, you'll see that the green and orange trace line up very nicely.
They're all on this.
If you look at the far right of the response on the bottom, you'll see that they line up pretty nicely there as well. So what I'm talking about is this area over here on the left, those two lines are almost a dead overlay. And these two lines over here, it's a little jagged, but at higher frequencies, we're not as concerned about it, but they're almost a dead-on overlay as well. What about in the middle here? We have the orange one that's really high, and the green one that's fairly low. Now, this isn't a magnitude response. This is a phase response. So they are shifted in time at that particular point. The high end and the low end are okay, but in the middle, not so much. So when we actually combine things, that may become a bit of a problem. So take a look at that there. I did want to spend a moment and show you something before we do a combination of these two channels put together so you see what happens when we combine left and right. I wanted to point out these little sections. On the top, you'll see that there's like a dip that we've seen before. And on the bottom, we see a similar little wiggle that we've seen before. Where have we seen that?
Stock on it, but I'll have to send an email and just wait for their response. They may have that as well.
Anything?
EQ in the
Yes.
chat.
Yes, fantastic. Yes, that exact little wiggle in the green response and the little squiggle on the phase response on the green one on the bottom.
Okay.
That is the result of an EQ filter that's been applied to try to compensate for some abnormality in the measured response. And you could see it in the phase response. Additionally, you can see this yellow line, right? The angle of the actual delay that's taking place. You can see that wrap. The orange one tracks to it pretty close. And if you get rid of some of the, what I call the EQ wiggles that show up on both the green and the yellow response at this particular point, you see that they're close, but they're just shifted enough. I wonder if that's going to be a problem. The one thing you might want to do is if you see that they're out of phase at that point, you might want to try, maybe flipping the polarity. I wonder what happens if we flip the polarity. Looking here, what we've done is simply combined left and right together to see what happens when we play both channels at the same time. So we first looked at left, then we looked at right. Now we're looking at left and right being played at the same time. The goal, if we remember from the history of stereo that we covered, the goal is a cohesive system with common arrival time, the phase domain. We're looking at same frequency response, and we're looking at the same overall level. So the blue response here, if green plus orange combines at that center point right there, we wound up with less energy. But if you look above and below that, we wind up with more energy. There's a combination of energy up high and down low, but a loss of energy in the middle. Now we remember the 3 dB rule. Some of these variances, especially the one at the top end, that's 6 dB louder, which makes sense. That means they're perfectly in line. Remember, when we doubled our speaker, we gained 3 dB. But this is also another amplifier channel, so we've also doubled our amplifier power. So we should see 6 dB. If we don't, that means we've lost some energy. And the way we've lost it is in the time domain. We've shifted. And if you remember our conversation about waveforms, when we talked about shifting a 3 and 4 volt waveform by 90 degrees, that was a phase shift. And we could never get the full 7. Well, here's where that comes in. If we don't line up perfectly in time, we won't get the full power of our system. And we've done something horribly wrong in the middle because we've actually lost energy, which means we may be getting closer to 180 degrees out of phase, which would be a cancellation effect or some degree of that cancellation. Now, if you focus on this is the original traces. And if you see where that dip is, it's really close to where those two traces are far apart. The phase traces don't line up. And when they don't line up is where you lose energy. So here's where you might say, well, that's pretty darn close to 180 degrees out. So let's flip the polarity and see what happens, okay? So let's just get a good look at this chart real quick. And now we flip the polarity. Look what happens in the middle. We gained all the energy. That's where it is. Ha-ha, we fixed it. Or did we? What about up high and down low? We lost that energy up high and down low. This is what happens when you flip polarity. This makes complete sense. Where it was high before, it's now low. Where it was low before, it's now high. That combination of energy is literally flipped direction, and that's what polarity does. This is something different. This is like we need to adjust phase, but we just want to adjust it in a certain region. Is there anything in our toolbox that allows us to adjust just the phase response in a certain region? Anything, any tool at all?
Andy says all pass filter. Brandon saying Eminem. Everybody's on it.
Fantastic. So here, if you take a really good look at this, look at the variances. There's a lot of energy that's lost because we're not lined up in time. So what we're going to do is we're going to pop in an all-pass filter, and look what we got. Look at that gray line. It takes all the good that we had before from the polarity inversion and keeps it. It gets rid of all the bad by putting it back to the way it was before. We've gained everything back. The all-pass filter solved the problem. It didn't actually change the magnitude response of either one of the speakers, but the combination of it are now lined up in time, and it gives us all that energy that we're looking for. Now, here's where you can go down a rabbit hole. You could spend hours looking at the phase response and get them perfectly dialed in, and it's worth every bit of that. As long as you're compensated, the result is going to be there. So now, let's get into this a little bit better. Just as a side note, there are a lot of people that will still use all-pass filters and not really look at the phase response. And I refer to this as flying blind. You might get lucky. You might manage to hit it pretty darn close, and you'll see an improvement in your combined magnitude response. But you could be leaving, I call them, you're leaving dBs on the table. There's output that you might be able to extract if you could only see what you were doing. Phase allows visibility. Knowing how to look at phase, understanding how the relationships work, allows you to see all this missing energy and bring it back into the system. This is why it's called advanced tuning techniques. These are the techniques that we can use to get even more out of a system. The basic tune gets us so freaking close, and the better we get that, the easier these phase measurements are to look at. All those little wiggles that you see, those are filters, right? There's some kind of filter, and if we made that nice and smooth, the phase traces would also be nice and smooth, because there's always a correlation from the magnitude response to the phase response. All right.
So Aaron had a good question. He says, how did you know which channel to put the all pass on?
That's an excellent one, and let me go. There's a slide. I'm looking for my overlay. Yep, there it was. There. So if you're looking at the orange trace, right? The orange trace is has a steeper slope. If you see what I'm talking about, that. So the green one there is a little bit later in time, right? So we need to apply more delay on the green trace than the orange trace. So remember that yellow line that I had put on the traces showing the angle of adding delay, right? So here you see the orange one has a certain angle at a certain location, and the green one, particularly in this region, it's not as steep. So we could technically try adding delay to that to bring that angle in and create something that might match the orange one. But it had lined up so well at the extremes, you'd also be affecting the higher frequency at that point as well, which is not desirable. That's how we know an all-pass filter will work. If the traces line up at the extremes, but they don't align in a certain area, look at the phase traces. The one that has a shallower slope to it, it needs some application of delay. And in this case, we're using the phase EQ and the all-pass filter to bring that in and walk it over. But there are other tricks that we'll get to. And that's an excellent question. Thank you. The other thing that I can tell you is you guess. You could try it and look at the phase measurement and see if it changed in the direction that you wanted. If it gets worse, you pick the wrong channel. Go to the other channel, do the same thing, and now look at it. So depending on what measurement system you're working with, that can be either very complicated or very, very simple. But I think once you get comfortable looking at these traces and what I call getting through the noise, like if you look at that, there's a lot of noise there. It's hard to look at. But when you start focusing in, you can really start seeing the differences between that, and knowing how those tools work gives you some insight on which tool to use and on which channel to use it. Like this, it's impossible to see any differences there, so we clean it up by getting rid of the traces, right? All right, and here's the all-pass applied. Now we're going to look at another application of phase traces. So here's the subwoofer that we're going to add to that now very dialed-in main system. The left and right are playing, and we're going to add the subwoofer. So the pink response there is the subwoofer's response, and you see the phase response. And again, you see some filter behavior going on with that as you go from left to right. You can see it in the magnitude response, and it corresponds in the phase response. So it wiggles exactly as you'd expect. Lay in the main speakers, and you'll see that through that mid-range area, around 200 hertz and higher, it lines up pretty good. Now, once you get up above a certain point, the sub has crappy phase response because you're way outside of its band range. That kind of noise up there doesn't make any sense at all. So don't pay much attention to that. But if you take a look what's going on down, around the 50 hertz region, you'll see that the green and the pink are diverging. They're getting further away in terms of the phase response. So if we were to combine the two of these, we wind up with something that looks like this. The higher end, obviously, there's no problem because they sum perfectly. There's no big deal. At the lower end, again, there's really no big deal. But in that transition region, it looks like we've lost some energy. It seems like they're not playing very nicely together. And if you look at where that corresponds to some of the phase measurements, that's why they are slightly out of phase. Something you could try in this case, and it's hard to see in this one. I think I have a better image. So go to there. Is flipping the polarity of the sub. Now remember that this isn't going to change the magnitude response, and you can see that here. They're actually dead-on overlay on the magnitude response, so that glowy purpley line there, whatever you want to call it, is the flipped polarity. Oh, sorry, that's the original one, and the red one is the polarity inverted. So all we've done is we flipped the traces, and if you look at these arrows here, that one and that one, they're at the same frequency, but one's at the 0 line and the other one's at the 180 line. That's what polarity inversion does. It takes whatever's at 0, puts it at 180, whatever's at 180, puts it at 0, basically flips it. If we were to sum this sum to the mains, we get that. Now you could look at the two different phase traces, the gold one versus this new tan one. The new tan one, if you look at the magnitude response up there, the yellow one, we lost energy. The tan one, we've gained it. That's a swing of 6 dB. That's like 4 times the amplifier power at key frequencies, right in that 40, 50, 60 hertz region. That's a ton of extra energy that you just found by flipping the polarity. And some people that what I call, say, are flying blind, they would flip that and say, mission accomplished. I got everything. Take a look at those phase traces. You see anything about those phase traces that maybe we could get better? Maybe look at this. These are the actual subwoofer phase trace and that tan phase trace. At some points, they overlay nicely, but at some, not so much. Is there anything that we might be able to apply that gets us a better result? Here's a hint. Take a look at this one. There's a new gray trace that's overlaid. And I know it's a mess, and I want to see who's able to see through the mess. Look what's on the gray trace. You'll see that you can barely see it. There's a little red trace right around that 80 hertz region, 90, 100 hertz. You'll see that the red from the subwoofer and now the gray combined one, they almost perfectly overlay. We changed something. The orange one isn't there now, right? We can barely see the orange one. Here's another hint. There's your orange trace compared to the red trace. What can we do to the orange trace to make it line up better with the red trace? What tool can we work with? What can make the angle of that phase wrap shift and get closer to the red one?
Andy says all pass filter.
Now, all pass filters.
Brandon says delay.
I think I like Brandon. Andy, what an all pass filter will do is also affect frequencies above it. And since we're dealing with an interaction with a subwoofer, that may not be what we're looking for. But you know what? You could try it because it will affect the low frequency. But ultimately, what we're truly trying to do is change that angle of the phase, and a delay can absolutely do that. And what we do here with the gray trace is we're adding the delay. And if you look at where the gray trace winds up, the orange one was there and the gray one is there. We got more output. We gained another dB&1, almost 2 dB in a transitional region. That's like a 60% improvement in effective power that if you were blind and not looking at the phase trace, you would never see that. You left 60% of your amplifier power sitting on the phase table. By being able to look at all this, it's a wonderful way of getting the most out of a system. Now I got to be honest with you. I wish I could give you a play-by-play of exactly how to win this game. But the best I can do is teach you the basics, believe it or not. The method that we shared in session 201 is a nice method to take advantage of some of the DSP tools to get a system that's in the ballpark of where you can listen to it and make it sound great. When it gets to the advanced level, I'm an American football fan, right? And the semantics and the mechanics of being a football player is pretty basic. I can show you how to throw a ball. I can show you how to catch a ball. I could show you how to run a route, how to block, how to tackle. I could show you all of these basics. That doesn't mean you're going to win. You have to do it. You have to practice. You have to work with it and learn how the game unfolds. You got to learn how the car unfolds, or the boat, or the home. You have to look at these traces and kind of get a feel for the way those mechanics work. And if you have to, call an audible. You might have to make some changes. Andy, you want to try an all-pass filter? Hell, try it. You'll see the interactions and see where it benefits you and see where it may hurt you. That's how we learn how to play the game more successfully. I don't have a good roadmap. I have a good overall process that I tend to follow. But as soon as I get into it, and I shared this with Kevin and Rob the other day, it's like a fight with Mike Tyson back in the day. Everyone's got a game plan until they get punched in the mouth. Then suddenly you have to scramble and figure out what the new game plan is. Good, damn it, that hurt. So what I want to share with you are the tools to manipulate magnitude response and phase response. Give you the overall targets and goals of where we're going with that. But at the end, you got to listen to it. That's where the magic comes in. If you know the tool set, you know the overall targets and the overall goal, you can get into the game and start listening to it and make the adjustments and make it sound the way we want for our customers now that we know those goals. So in summary, note the time, gentlemen. In summary, we covered the history of stereo, and what that was about is what stereo and imaging is all about. We needed to cover that. If you don't know where you're going, it doesn't matter what the tools are. You have no idea what you're actually doing. So we needed to identify where the target actually is going to live, and that's what stereo and imaging is. And that gave us the 3 pillars of tuning. And as we peeled back the 3 pillars of tuning, we learned the importance of phase and timing. And ultimately, what we learned is that tuning can be repeatable. We can make this a repeatable effort where we can get so close in that ballpark that we get into the best part of it, and that's listening. Don't skip it. Just because the curve looks good doesn't mean the car sounds good. You got to jump in there. You got to listen to some tracks and adjust it based on what you're hearing. Yeah, you could read the defense, but when you're actually out there running against it, things are going to be different. You have to actually experience it, and when you do, you can make adjustments on the fly and make it sound the way you want. And I would always recommend, once you do make it sound the way you want, recapture that data, analyze that data as well, compare it to other things you've done, and share it with people so you can get some feedback. And you may wind up modifying your targets to be better for the next go round. Do you have any questions?
So on the chat, when we were talking about the delay there, a lot of people were saying you might want to change the crossover slopes or frequencies on that. And I would say if we were just looking at the frequency response, that would probably be our first go-to for sure. But looking at the timing of it and looking at the angles of the phase response down there, we can see that we need to change those angles a little bit, which is what delay does. And these are things that you're going to pick up on as you go through and do stuff. And like Steve said, and I'll just push it home there, is practice it, try different things so you can see what the actual result of each attempt is. So you can try a different filter slope and you can see what the attempt is. You can try some delay, try polarity, try all pass filters. And once you start seeing what the effects are, you're going to end up seeing what you need. You're going to end up being able to read these graphs a little bit better and choosing which one you want to do quicker. And it definitely is practice makes perfect process there.
I agree with that 100%. And that's why when we're going over the different tools and I'm like kind of clicking around, when we looked at what a high pass and low pass filter would do to the wraps, right? We know that that's affecting frequency response. So you have to be aware of what those changes are going to be in both domains. When we looked at delay, we saw the angle of those delays and how it made those wraps shift in those both in the severity of the angle and the general location of where that first waveform wrap is. We took a look at the changes in polarity. And when you start learning and kind of get familiar with the way these traces look and how common they are between different things, you can start really getting a feel for which tool to grab. If the magnitude response changes and a result of combination, almost always that's going to be a phase response. And crossovers, yes, they can affect phase, as you see here, but they're also affecting the magnitude response. So you're actually chasing two things at that point. But you know what? At this level, when you're doing advanced tuning, that's where you experiment. Again, the method kind of, I don't want to say goes out the window because ultimately the goals are all about the same, but it's more about the tools and knowing what the tool's going to do. Like if you saw a phase wrap, you're unlikely to use an EQ to try to address a phase wrap because the phase shift is not that dramatic with an EQ. It's just a little wiggle. It doesn't cause a wrap like a crossover might, or a high pass or low pass filter, or an all pass filter. Those will cause wraps. Delay causes wraps and additional shifts in time. EQs don't do that. So knowing how the EQs work and how all these other filters work gives you a better idea of what tool to grab from the toolbox. Yes, I know you can hammer a nail with a screwdriver, but it's not the right tool. So that's kind of the goal of the advanced tuning techniques. That's kind of where we were at with all of this. It's just kind of giving you an idea of what's possible with all the different tunes.
And we got a couple
practices. Yeah,
Sorry. We got a couple questions online. Just wondering what softwares and that we're using to measure for all of this.
A lot of these graphs you can do in REW. You can do in True RTA. There's other systems that are out there, like there's a system called Smart that's really very powerful that allows some really good analysis of this. So we tend to recommend REW an awful lot. For me, it's the price. I just love the price. It's free. So using a free software package with some basic measurement stuff. Are we done with the keynote real quick? If I have to jump back in, I'll jump back in. But I like REW because it is a
I lost the audio.
Sorry,
You're
muted when I came out. Yeah, sorry. So I like REW because it's free software. If it has a drawback to it, it's that when you're looking at phase traces, you have to jump through, I call them hoops. You have to jump through a couple of hoops to set it up to start taking those measurements. And then once you do, you measure one channel, then you measure the other channel, you compare the two and determine what you want to adjust. You make that adjustment, then you remeasure the channel that you just adjusted and compare it to the other traces you've already done. So it's one and then another. And if you notice on my charts that I shared today, you saw that I kept adding additional traces, and then I ultimately had to pull back the ones that were clouding my vision. And that's kind of what REW is like, where you add a bunch of traces and then you peel back the ones that you're not really going to look at. So, if it's got a weakness, it's probably that it's a bit of a plug and chug mode. That's where knowing the tools becomes really critical. If you know the tools, you minimize the back and forth, between your measurement and analysis. I hope that answered it.
And the nice thing is that running an analysis is free, right?
Absolutely.
Got two questions on with new cars and trucks with all pass filters. Should we play with it or leave it? What is the best way to deal with factory systems that already have all pass filters applied? What method that we're using here is actually after the fact, with just doing the final tuning. We're assuming you've used some sort of OEM integration device to handle that.
It's a really excellent question. Now, JL Audio's mentality is and has been that the processor that's built into the amplifier is there to tune the audio system that you've installed, not to change any of the tuning that's been done prior to it. However, knowing how to look at the phase traces, if you are using a factory system that has an all-pass filter, you now know how to look for that by measuring one channel, then measuring the other channel, and then comparing the two. That's when you'll see an all-pass behavior. Now, Rob loves talking about this, and I'll either let him do it or I'll try and he'll interrupt me and correct me if I'm saying it wrong. A lot of cars, they're using an all-pass filter because they work. They really optimize the time alignment of that particular side of the vehicle to optimize it from both the left and the right, because the relative phase from left to right is going to be the same. So what you're changing on one is having a similar effect on the other seat. And that's a great thing. So in many of those cases, if there's an all-pass filter in there, leave it there, because it's probably helping you more than it's hurting you. And how do you find out? You measure it. You actually measure it. Too often what I see a lot of people doing is taking one processor that's doing integration and system tuning as one piece, and they wind up chasing their tail because they're not sure if they're actually addressing the acoustics of the system or the electronics of the factory audio. And in those cases, I would say just cut bait and figure out which one you want to fix first. Do you want to take care of the factory system first and then tune the audio system, or you want to try to do it in one fell swoop? Both are a valid way of going. If there's an all-pass filter on the factory system, most of the time you want it there. I know that sounds crazy for a company that's all about the high end and screw the factory stuff, but the reality is, like in Rob's car, he has two systems. One is using all the factory I'm going to say it, all the factory goodness to optimize a sound field for both the passenger and the driver. But then he's got another setting where he says, screw all of that. See what you're showing over there. It says, screw all of that. He's got a dedicated system that basically he takes his portable media player and he pipes it in as a standard 2-channel, and he's dialed that in separate as a separate preset. And you could absolutely do that, and I would recommend that.
Yeah, the thing with if you're going to integrate into a vehicle with a factory all pass, that's kind of one of those things where you need to have a conversation with the customer and find out what their goals are. If they're a 2-channel diehard, you're going to have to find a way to work around that. But for the typical customer that just wants it to sound better, if you go from this, you know, in many cases with all pass filters, it's DTS neural, it's a surround sound type sound in the vehicle. You take that away and go to 2-channel, a lot of times the customers are going to feel like, wow, it's not, yeah, it's clearer, it's this, it's that, but it's not as well rounded. It's not, I don't have that surround sound now. It actually could be detrimental. So on the sales floor, if you know your customer is not that hardcore audiophile, they just want it to sound better, I would not try to fix it at all, and just take the signal from the factory amplifier, you run it straight into your VXIs, which is what I did in my car. I have no crossovers on, no delay. I used all of the Acura processing and just did EQ and level corrections due to the C7s. I replaced the garbage factory ones with. But, you know, if you do something like that, you're going to enhance what's already, like my car, it imaged well. Tonality, it was awful. So I was able to enhance that with better speakers, amplifiers, and then correct it for the new speakers. And for a 2-seat setup, it sounds good. But for the person that wants that, you know, rock solid, center image, everything phase aligned to one location, that's what I have my digital preset for when I'm in the car by myself. So you just got to know what your customers are looking for if you are working with all pass filters and have to make the decision to keep or work around them.
Oh, excellent, Rob. Thank you for sharing the details.
If you're
Someone's adding? Sorry. All right. So my take on all of this is something that our sales team is not really fond of. You know, we do offer a DSP processor that allows for integration of a lot of audio systems, the fixed processors, Fix 82 and the Fix 86. And while I think it's a fantastic piece, it has its place. What I would rather you use is one of those pack pieces or a nav TV piece that interrupts the signal before it gets all mucked around with, and you get a digital signal from that directly into an amplifier like a VXI product, where it takes a digital input, and that's just straight 2-channel without any messing around. Then I can tune the system using all the methods that we've talked about, you know, in 201 and today in 301. Then we just are tuning the system. We don't have to undo any of that other stuff. If I have that as an option, hell yeah, I want that. If I don't have that as an option and I need to fix something, that's why we have the fix. So it's not always the right tool, but if it is the right tool, go ahead and use it. There's nothing wrong with it. We chose as a company to isolate the two. There's integration and there's system tuning. You can do both at the same time, but sometimes it's not as easy to get the results you're looking for. That's my take. Anthony was showing some competitive product that has an all-in-one approach, and that's very common. Most companies are doing an all-in-one approach. We are the weird ones for sure. Our thought was, and I know this sounds like a sales pitch to our business partners, but sell what you need, you know, and don't charge your customer for something that they're not going to use. That's been our mentality. So if they're doing integration, sell integration. If they're doing system tuning, sell system tuning. If they're doing both, sell them both. It's okay. It's, you know, this, you'll take a couple $100 out of an integration piece and put it into your labor dollars if you have to, whatever it takes. You know, let's make it so that the customer's getting what they truly are paying for. A better system is what they want. How did you guys find the content today? I know it's pretty heady, but I think we did, over the past several days, we did, you know, quite a bit of planting seeds and allowing them to kind of grow, and we kind of built on top of those things. That was the goal all along. You know, when Dave and I first talked about these sessions in general, he was like, can you do a class on system tuning? It's like, no, I can't do a class because they'd be sitting in front of the computer for hours at a time. By breaking it up, I think it made it a little bit easier to digest. And by the time we got to this, if I started talking about phase and wavelength polarity and all this other stuff just today, it might be overwhelming. So, Paul, yeah, it's a lot to take in, without a doubt. And yeah, you don't need to be an audio engineer. It would help. But the truth is, you guys know the majority of already. You know, you already know the frequency domain. You know how EQs work. You know how high pass and low pass filters work. All we've done is kind of showed you the other side of the coin and showed you what the phase aspect was. And if you have a way of looking at that, it's very powerful. There is something that we intentionally left out. We left out how to set up your measurement system to take impulse response measurements. Ooh, I like this guy. So the reason why we left that out is I don't know what measurement system you guys are going to use. And I honestly don't know if you have the interest to go through the process of setting up something like that. But if you do, Kevin and Rob and I were talking earlier that, that's a conversation. You let Dave know, you let us know, we'll guide you through. And again, we recommend REW because it's free and I can guide you through step by step of exactly how to set up that measurement system to take impulse response measurements. It's faster and easier to do that once you have that system set up. It's faster and easier than even a tape measure, if you can imagine it. You literally sit at the computer, you hit play, 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 and you get all those numbers and line up, and it's freaking awesome. So, if that's something you guys are interested in, we're here for you. These classes are not meant to be fully encompassing where you are now an audio engineer. It's really meant to show you what's possible with the tools that you already have. And if you need some help, let us know.
Okay. You guys hear me?
We hear you.
Awesome. Well, hey, Steve, appreciate you spending time with us. Obviously, Kevin and what's his name?
Ryan or something like that?
Ryan, Rob. Kevin, Rob, and Steve, appreciate you guys spending the time today. Obviously, today's session was pretty heavy, and good news is we've recorded it. Unlike yesterday, we had a little bit of a technical glitch, but this is the one. If we wanted to have it recorded, it'd be this one. You guys can play it back numerous times. If you missed a point or you weren't quite sure, feel free to rewatch it. We'll post those links shortly. Next week, we are going to be doing on Tuesday 2 sessions. Here we go. Session 101B, which was a new session we decided to add on, and that has to do with the features and benefits of the MVI amplifiers. And then we'll also be doing later that day session 201B, which is a basic marine tune. So similar to one of yesterday's sessions, but catered towards the MVI amplifiers. Okay.
And the truth is, you can use all the methods we just talked about today on any system, boat, car, anything really, power sport if you want to. It just depends on how far you want to take it.
You know what? I really recommend you guys tuning into the MVI session, because let me tell you, it'll be an eye opener for you. I think you'll have a new outlook of marine audio and what can be done with marine amplification. It's unlike anything that you're familiar with right now. Very different than M series or any other product like that. I think you'll have a new outlook altogether. It'll make you more efficient and make your jobs a lot easier. So, want to thank you guys for your participation. Obviously, your time. I know some of you guys are some of you are still open and you're juggling this in between, and
Appreciate that.
it's really appreciated. And last but not least, going back to what Steve was saying about interfaces, I want to hammer that and do a little self plug. We are doing NAV TV for Canada, and that's something that did a soft launch for us before this whole coronavirus hit. But I have to reiterate, we are seeing product that has all-in-one DSP or OEM integration built into it. But you are always better to get that signal post equalization or anything like that than trying to reverse it. That's like taking a ball of tinfoil or a piece of tinfoil, rolling it into a ball, and then trying to flatten it out and make it exactly the way it was before. You'll never be able to do it. As great as the fix is, it does a pretty good job, but it's never as good as what the signal was before. And
it can't do everything. It can't address an all-pass filter.
Correct. So using a NAV TV or a pack piece or something like that, even if you are using somebody else's amplifier that has built-in DSP, for OEM integration, if you have those options, you're going to get better results by using those interfaces and trying to reverse it after it's all been done. So, anyways, more on that at a different session. Appreciate your time once again, guys, and thank you. We will see you Tuesday of next week.
Thanks, guys.
Have a good one, guys.